Hey, what's going on? This is Mr. Samingo. This is the first of many review PowerPoints about the for the AP Bio exam. We're going to go pretty quickly because this is again the stuff that we've already learned before. So when we do these presentations, we're going at a relatively quick pace because we're reviewing stuff you already learned and refreshing your memory. If at any point we're going too fast, obviously you can press pause, you can rewind and all that stuff. But the point is that you watch all these videos and take notes, you will have enough information to get you prepared for the exam. Also know that for this PowerPoint, so you're going to have a quiz every day. You already know what the questions are going to be. And also we're going to check your notes. So this one's about ecology. This is the very, very first thing we learned, so it kind of gets me nostalgic about all the times that we talked about this stuff when we first barely knew each other. But it's been a long time, so we're going to go over it really quickly and make sure that you understand it. So first of all, ecology, the term ecology, OG meaning the study of, and eco meaning the study of interaction. So we're talking about how things interact. We're also talking about how things interact, whether they're living or non-living. Biotic, bio means living, abiotic, a meaning no, and bio meaning life, not life. So when we talk about biotic, we're talking about organisms. When we're talking about abiotic, we're talking about temperature, water. Salinity means like how salty the water is, sunlight, and soil. So ecology is all about the study of organisms and non-living things as well, biotic and abiotic. So the hierarchy, if you remember how things are organized from smallest to biggest, first there's us, we're organisms. A whole bunch of organisms make a population, so they're the same organisms that are living in the same area. A whole bunch of populations make up a community, so different organisms that inhabit a particular area. Then there's an ecosystem, which is a whole bunch of communities, and the collection of all the ecosystems, which makes Earth, is biosphere, the global ecosystem. Then we talked about different types of learning. So maybe you forgot about this, remember watching the videos, remember making these posters. So basically learning can be simple or they can be complex. It's a change in behavior resulting from an experience. So when you say you learned something, it means you experienced and you changed how you do things. Social learning means you change your behavior just because of how you imitate or learn from others, whether it's those in the same community or from others. Okay, so that's social learning. Innate behavior, if you remember the very first time that we talked, innate means a behavior that you already have that you don't have to learn. Okay, so unlearned behavior. It's environmental indifference, so no matter where you are, if I took a penguin and moved it to a different area, it's going to act the same way. So it's environmentally independent. These are called fixed action patterns. You remember FAPs. So they're innate behaviors that exhibit unchangeable sequences. So if you remember a goose, I think this is a goose, its inherent or innate behavior is to, if it sees an egg that is away from the rest of the eggs, its innate behavior, it's inclined to move it and roll it towards the rest of the eggs. So it could be a ball, it could be something else here, but the goose will always move it because it's something that is innate. It's triggered by a sign stimulus, so it's triggered by something. And the reason why they do that is because through evolution, we've been doing these activities to survive. So for some reason, a goose has to do this because later on, or not later on, but prior, they needed to do this or else they wouldn't have survived. So there's also types of directed movements. You might remember kinesis and taxis. Kinesis is a simple change or turning rate in response to a stimulus. So basically a sow bug will encounter and stay in a moist environment. So based on moisture, because it wants to be in a moist place, it'll move towards underneath this leaf. That's called kinesis. Taxis means automatic movement. So it's moved by stimulus but automatically. So for example, trout always face into the current. It's not something that they choose to do. It's not something they say like, oh, I'm going to move into the current today. It's an automatic movement. Taxis. It goes where, again, through evolution, that's where it needs to go to live. Now the types of learning. Okay, number one, there's habituation, which is a fancy word for habits, which means it's a loss of responsiveness to stimuli that convey little or no information. So it's the simplest form of learning, a habit. Okay. Then there's imprinting. You may remember imprinting, Lorenz's geese, where there's a small port in their life, a small period in their life where animals, just like these geese, learn everything, and it's generally irreversible. So in this experiment, you remember when they're baby geese, they followed this guy because that's when they learned everything. Or during the point in life where they learned everything, that's when they learned to follow this guy. Associative learning means associating one stimulus with another. It's also known as classical. So this one is a fruit fly. Basically, depending on odor and shock, it reacts in a certain way. I think the easiest example we talked about, I remember the picture of the bird eating the butterfly. So what happens in that example is that the bird eats the butterfly, and it's disgusting, so it throws up. So that learning is that I'm never going to eat anything with that color of the butterfly because it's disgusting, I'm going to throw up. Operant learning is what they call trial and error learning. So this is one that we had another example of. This is an example of, in this picture we have a mouse. I don't know what this particular experiment does, but I think it's one where if it presses the green or something like that, then food comes out, and it basically a reward or punishment is how some organisms learn. So if you do something and it fails, and you do something and it fails, and you do something and you get a reward, it will keep doing that behavior. And then there's cognition, which is how we learn. It's how you're learning this PowerPoint today. So you perceive, store, and use information. So whether it's cracking nuts or to get food, or learning to use your beak to get food, it's learning, it's like studying, it's understanding how things work and memorizing it. So in the future, you'll exhibit that behavior again. Territorial behavior, this is a behavior that animals do to defend their territory. So remember, in evolution, animals would die off or species would die, and you have to do things in order to survive. So one of the things that they had to do was mark territory or defend their territory. So whether it's these birds over here or these look like cheetahs defending their territory, that's another behavior that they've learned, or else they wouldn't survive. After that, remember, we learned 3 types of dispersals. I think you'll find this very easy, so we'll skip over it. Clumped, which is like these wolves, they live in clumps. Or your uniform, so these penguins, how they're all not together, but they're in uniform, like so. Or random, like these dandelions, they're growing in different areas, just completely random. Again, the reason why they're in these types of dispersals is depending on how they need to survive. So maybe the wolves are like this because they need to be in packs, and the penguins need to be like this because they need to be as far and separate as possible. And maybe the dandelions survive much better randomly. After that, we studied demography or demography, I don't know how to pronounce it, but this is where we studied how you could fluctuate or affect population size. So you know, additions is birth and subtraction is death. And then we had studied things called life tables. And then we also studied things called survivorship curves, and I'll show you some examples. A survivorship curve plots how many individuals there are at a certain age. So here are the 3 survivorship curves. Here's us, survivorship 1. Basically, we live, a lot of us survive at a young age, and then we tail off at the end. So low death rates early in life. Type 2 is constant, so you see the straight line, like squirrels. There's some that are alive at the beginning, and there's some that are alive midway, and then they're all gone. And then type 3, which is the opposite of humans, think of oysters or ants or anything that has tons of offspring. They have so much offspring that they die off so early, and some barely survive. So those are the 3 survivorship curves, 1, 2, and 3. You should know all 3. Then we studied population growth. This is an example of I guess you could say a slope of n, 1n, and this is 0.5n, so basically how populations grow. If you have ideal conditions, like humans, we grow exponentially. So you may have heard this or you remember this, that we're running out of space on Earth because we're growing exponentially. Okay. If you have unlimited resources, they're rare. So if you have a situation where you have limited resources, what happens is that you hit a carrying capacity, which is right here. It is represented by the letter K, which means it's the maximum stable population which can be sustained by the environment. So normally, look at this blue curve right now. In this blue curve, it grows exponentially. So normally in life, humans, like for example us, since everything is perfect, we grow like this. But because there's limited space, limited resources, limited food, for example, in this picture, there's this black line that says the maximum that this environment can hold is 1,500. So instead of going straight like this blue line, in real life, most populations are like this red line, where it grows exponentially and then it tails off to the carrying capacity. The formula for figuring out how fast the growth is, R max, which is again the maximum rate, R is rate, times the carrying capacity minus how many individuals there are divided by K. Again, we'll go over this in your equation sheet. And it's called an S curve. This is called an S curve, and this blue line is called a J curve. Then, just as you know, like the survivorship curves, you should know there's two types of species. They call them K and R. K representing the carrying capacity, so they carry populations close to it, or R, which stands for rate, or they maximize reproduction. So if you remember, K has high care, low birth numbers, good survival of young, and density dependent. So think about us, or elephants, when we say K selection. We have very few kids, but those kids, they live for a long time. R, they grow exponentially, but they have very little care. So think of like insects. They have like thousands and thousands of babies, but they don't take care of these babies. They just hope that some of them live. So this is density independent, and think of cockroaches. They're R selected. So factors that limit population growth when they're density dependent, we're talking about things that where population matters. So predators, disease, competition, waste, those are things that are dependent on how dense, how many people there are in one area. Density independent are things that limit a population's growth, but it doesn't matter how big the population is or how dense it is. So the really easy one, or the only one that you have to remember, is natural disasters. So fire, flood, water. These things will destroy population no matter how dense it is. Then we looked at how age structure diagrams look like. Let's take a look at these three right here. This is Kenya, United States, and Italy. This represents rapid growth. So if you forgot how to read this, top to bottom, you should see how the ages. So from 0 to 4, 5 to 9, basically in groups of 5. Left to right, this is the percent of the population. So basically, a large part of the population is from 0 to 4, and a very, very, very small percent of the population is old. So if you have what they call a pyramid, this is called a pyramid, this is rapid growth. This is talking about a population that's going to grow exponentially really fast because there's a lot of kids, and then those kids will have lots of kids. That's rapid growth. Slow growth, you'll see, is like, it has a little bulge in the middle right here. But as I get lower, it's shrinking a little bit. It gets a little bit thinner at the bottom. That's called slow growth. And zero growth, or decrease, I mean, it's kind of hard to see, like, but it's supposed to be like almost like a perfect rectangle, meaning like it's the same, everything is the same on every age. So it's not really growing. And even in some cases, it's like decreasing, where it's like an inverted pyramid. Then if you remember this, we talked about different interactions that species can have. Back in the first month of school, we talked about smiley faces. So smiley face, sad face, or sad face, or smiley face, smiley face. So interspecific competition is when within species they compete for resources. And that's a minus. And competitive exclusion principle, if you remember this rule, it says two species cannot exist if their niches are identical. Or if two people have the same job or require the same food, they will not exist. Only one will eventually live. The one with a slight advantage will eliminate the other. A niche, as I said, the ecological niche, is the sum of everybody's use of the resources in the environment. So a fundamental, I don't know if you guys remember this picture, but a fundamental niche is the niche that's potentially occupied, and realized is what actually happens. So for example, here are two types of, I think these are barnacles. And at high tide, these can live, the thalamus, and the blue ones, they can survive in the ocean, the balanus. So this is the realized niche. Okay, so this is here and this is here. But the fundamental niche of the thalamus, they can live everywhere. This brown one can live all the way top and all the way to bottom. But the reality is that it only occupies this top one because the blue one hogged the bottom piece. Predation is happy face, small face. One species is happy and the other one is sad. So basically the other one eats the other one for survival. Because of that, we've learned about these adaptations. I think you remember learning about these. There's cryptic coloration, where there's camouflage, so think about like a snake. There's aposematic, or warning coloration, so the bright color of poisonous animals. Remember, like red, like the red of a spider, the red dot of a spider or of a snake means it's poisonous. There's Predation mimicry. Remember, this means something is going to mimic another animal that's dangerous, but it's not really. So think of I think it was a snake that also had the red dot, but it's not really, it doesn't have poison. But since it mimicked that, nobody eats it. And then there's Mullerian mimicry. This is kind of like that butterfly thing I was telling you about. Two bad-tasting species resemble each other, so they avoid them both. So the bird eats a butterfly that's disgusting and makes it throw up. Now anything that looks like a butterfly, it's safe. And then there's herbivory, where we're talking about plants. They have, plants, they can't fight back. They can't do anything. They're just plants. So how they avoid predators, they have toxins like poisons. They have spines, and obviously like roses, they don't want to be picked. They have thorns. How is a community structured? They're diverse. So there's lots of species, it's rich, and there's also a lot, which is abundance. The one that has the most biomass, the one that's the most abundant, they call it the dominant species. And then, I don't know if you remember this, but keystone, back in the day, they have what they call arches, and the stone in the middle was, they called it the keystone, and if that stone fell, the whole arch fell apart. The species that exerts the control on the community structure, they call that the keystone species, or they're the species that if I removed it, the whole community falls apart. So for example, the most important example, or at least the one that you should remember, think of a sea otter. If a sea otter disappeared, that means the sea urchins that they eat would rise, and then the forests would be eaten by all these urchins, and then the kelp forests die, all the other animals in this kelp forest die, all because of this one sea otter. Then we talked about disturbances, what can happen to a community. A disturbance is anything that changes the community by removing them or changes all the resources. So fire, drought, flood, storm, us destroying an environment, that's called a disturbance. And then when a disturbance happens and then there's a new transition to new species or a new environment, that's called succession. Just like, when a king succeeds or a prince succeeds the king, it's kind of like when an environment succeeds another environment. That's called ecological succession. So primary succession means there's no soil yet, and maybe it's like a volcanic island or a glacier, or it's just dirt, and it's starting a new community. That's called primary. Secondary is when, like, say there was a fire or an abandoned farm, everything gets destroyed, and we start a new community all over again. That's called secondary succession. And then we studied different ecosystems. Just to be quick, an ecosystem, again, is the sum of all the organisms plus all the abiotic factors. And an ecosystem, what makes it very special is two different processes. We talked about energy flow, and we talked about chemical cycling. Again, this is review from way back in month number 1. So energy flow, just to be clear, energy flows from the sun and eventually turns into heat or goes into the ground. Everything else, like chemicals, they cycle, like water cycles, or nitrogen cycles, or carbon cycles. It stays in forever. But these orange arrows, energy, it just goes from the sun and then it dies. It doesn't come back around. Energy does not get cycled. So we talked about trophic structures also. A trophic structure is a fancy word for feeding, trophic for energy. So think about a food chain. So food chain go from plants to herbivores to carnivores to decomposers. That's called a food chain. If I do a whole bunch of food chains together, that's called a food web. So here's an example of a food web, which is basically just a whole bunch of food chains like together in the one picture. And then here's an example of how energy is flowing through ecosystem. From the sun, it goes to plants, plants to plant eaters to meat eaters, and eventually we die. And then microorganisms, the trinivores, decomposers, they eat us, and then the heat just goes into the ground and energy is gone. We also learned about something called primary production. Primary production is the total amount, or GPP, is the total amount of energy that's produced by all your plants. The reason why is because plants take in light from the sun and make energy for everybody else. So if there's no primary production, then nobody else lives. And we could measure that for every different type of biome. Okay. Net primary production is all the gross primary production minus all the energy used. So primary production, GPP gross, means count up all the energy that is made. NPP is count all the energy is made and then minus how much we actually use. So NPP equals GPP minus respiration. So then we studied like different ecosystems, like who makes the most. The open ocean has the most net primary production. The open ocean, it has the most percentage of the Earth's surface area, but per unit or per like area, it barely makes a lot of energy because it's open ocean. But overall, it makes some of the most energy because even though per like foot, for example, it barely makes energy, the ocean is so huge that it makes a lot of energy. In reverse, something like the tropical rainforest that you see here, it only makes up 3% of the world's area, but it makes like 2,200 energy. Like the plants in the rainforest make a ton of energy. So percentage-wise, it makes a lot of energy also. Even though it's so small, per foot or per unit of area, it makes a ton of energy. How do you affect primary production? Basically, how come some things are good and some things are bad? Basically, two things. How much light is there, obviously, or else you can't have photosynthesis, and how many nutrients are available, how much light and how much food are there. Other things are also temperature and moisture, and a special case, if a lake has too much algae because there's so much production or whatever, they call that eutrophic. Then we talked about how the energy between trophic levels is very inefficient. So every time something is eaten, like a plant is eaten by a caterpillar, only 10% of that is actually transferred over to the next thing. So for example, if a caterpillar eats 200 joules of energy, 100 of it just goes into poop. Okay, so this is feces. So half of the energy that you make, you just poop it out. 67 of it you're actually going to use in respiration, and 33 of the joules is used for growth. So really, it's almost like barely any of it is used, and a lot of it is lost as heat.